My name is Clara, I'm 41 years old, and last Christmas I learned my brother never really saw me as family. I've always been the kind of person who craved family connection. Maybe it's because I grew up in a house where love was conditional, measured out in teaspoons depending on who was shining brightest at the moment. And in our family, the one who always seemed to shine was my younger brother, Mark. Mark was the golden child. Handsome, charismatic, always saying the right thing in front of the right people. He excelled in sports, got scholarships, charmed teachers, and later built a career everyone admired. Our parents adored him. They hung his trophies in the living room, told his stories at every dinner, and introduced him as their pride and joy. Me? I was the responsible one. The quiet one. The one who didn't cause trouble, but also didn't inspire fireworks. I married young, had a son, and when my marriage fell apart, I shouldered the blame alone. While Mark was celebrated for every victory, my struggles were met with sighs and subtle judgments. Still, I held on to family gatherings like lifelines. Thanksgiving, birthdays, Christmas dinners. I told myself these were the moments that mattered, the times when we could put everything aside and just be together. Even if I felt like the outsider at times, I kept showing up, kept cooking dishes to share, kept hoping that one day I would feel truly wanted at that table. Last Christmas, I told myself it would be different. I wanted it to be special, not just for me but for my son, Ethan. He's 12, bright-eyed, sensitive, and far too perceptive for his age. He had noticed the little things that his uncle rarely spoke to me with kindness, that his grandparents seemed quicker to scold me than to praise me. But he never said it outright. Instead, he just clung to me a little tighter when we visited. That morning, I woke up early and made my grandmother's recipe for sweet potato casserole. It was always my contribution to Christmas dinner, the one dish I felt proud of. As I stirred the marshmallows on top until they melted golden brown, I told myself that tonight, maybe things would feel different. Maybe Mark would smile at me without sarcasm. Maybe my parents would thank me sincerely. Maybe, just maybe, I'd feel like part of the family again. When we arrived at my parents' house, the warmth of the fireplace greeted us, along with the sound of laughter spilling from the kitchen. Mark's laughter. Of course. He was already there, already the center of attention. "Clara," my mother said, a little too brightly, as if my arrival were an afterthought. She kissed my cheek quickly before turning back to Mark, who was in the middle of telling a story about his latest business deal. My father barely looked up from carving the turkey. I set my casserole on the counter, biting my lip as I watched Mark wave his hands dramatically, earning laughter from the room. He didn't even pause to acknowledge me. Ethan tugged my sleeve. "It smells good, Mom," he whispered, nodding toward the casserole. I smiled down at him, grateful for his small kindness, even if it wasn't the recognition I secretly longed for. We sat down at the table, the Christmas spread laid out in all its glory: turkey, stuffing, casseroles, pies. Everyone passed dishes around, voices overlapping in cheerful noise. I tried to join in, offering small comments here and there, but they slid past unnoticed. When I complimented Mark's story, he didn't even look at me. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table. I forced a smile, swallowing down the familiar ache of invisibility. The conversation turned to childhood memories. My parents laughed about Mark's football games, his prom dates, his college acceptance letter. When I tried to mention one of my own memories, a school play I had starred in when I was young, Mark cut me off with a smirk. "Oh, come on, Clara. Nobody remembers that. You're always trying to make yourself the center of attention." The table erupted in laughter. Heat crawled up my neck, shame burning in my chest. I wanted to disappear, to crawl under the table and hide. But instead, I sat there, smiling weakly, pretending it didn't hurt. That's what I always did, pretend, but this time was different. Because as the laughter died down, Mark leaned back in his chair, looked me dead in the eyes, and said the words that would change everything. "Nobody wants you at this table." The room went silent. Forks clinked against plates. My parents looked down, avoiding my gaze. No one defended me. No one spoke up. Just me, sitting there in shock, with my son's small hand tightening around mine. But I could never have predicted the cruelty my brother would unleash that night. It started with whispers, but ended with a sentence that cut deeper than any knife. The moment those words left Mark's mouth, "Nobody wants you at this table," I felt the air sucked out of the room. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, casual, dismissive, like I was nothing more than a stain on the tablecloth. His lips curled into a half smile, as though humiliating me was entertainment, not cruelty. I looked around, waiting, hoping for someone to contradict him. For my mother to scold him, for my father to tell him that wasn't fair, for anyone to say, "That's not true, Clara belongs here." But no one did. My mother busied herself with straightening the napkins. My father carved another slice of turkey, avoiding eye contact. My cousins and their spouses looked down at their plates, shifting uncomfortably but saying nothing. The silence was its own betrayal. And then, just like that, the conversation picked back up. As if his words hadn't just shattered me in front of everyone. My humiliation was brushed aside like crumbs on the table. I felt my son's hand grip mine tighter under the table. I looked at him, and in his wide, frightened eyes, I saw the reflection of my pain. He knew what had happened. He knew his mother had just been told she wasn't wanted, and worse, he saw no one defend me. That was the moment something in me broke. I placed my fork down gently. The clink louder than the chatter around me. My throat ached, but I forced myself to stand without a word. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. My chair scraped back, the sound cutting through the laughter. The room fell silent again as I picked up my plate. My hands trembled, but I kept my face calm, composed. My son whispered, "Mom?" But I gave him a small nod, silently asking him to stay seated. I wouldn't let him be punished for following me. I carried my plate to the kitchen, each step heavier than the last. Behind me, I could hear the murmurs starting up again. Forks scraping against plates, laughter cautiously returning. My absence was nothing to them. I was nothing to them. In the kitchen, I set my plate down on the counter and leaned against it, gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. My chest heaved, but I refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not where they could hear me. I caught my reflection in the microwave door, my eyes red, my mouth trembling. I barely recognized the woman staring back. A woman small enough to be told she didn't belong in her own family. A knock at the doorway pulled me back. Ethan stood there, his little shoulders slumped, his eyes glistening. "I want to come with you," he whispered. My heart clenched. "No, sweetheart, stay. Eat your dinner." "I don't want to," he said stubbornly, his voice shaking. "I don't like it here." I crouched down in front of him, smoothing his hair back. "I know," I said softly. "But I don't want them to hurt you the way they hurt me. Please, just eat a little, and then we'll go, okay?" He nodded reluctantly, wiping his eyes before walking back to the table. My chest ached as I watched him slip back into his seat, so small among the towering adults who had just shown him the ugliest truth about family. I stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes, listening. The laughter grew louder again, conversations overlapping, Mark's booming voice dominating the room. They were fine without me. They didn't notice the emptiness in my chair. And in that moment, I realized something I had been denying for years. They had never really wanted me at that table. I was only ever tolerated. Convenient when they needed me, invisible when they didn't. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the hollow ache of years of silence, of pretending, of hoping things would change. But deep down I knew the truth. That dinner wasn't just another holiday, it was the night my family finally showed me exactly where I stood. The room was filled with laughter again before I even reached the hallway. I slipped away from the kitchen, plate abandoned on the counter, and found myself wandering the dimly lit hallway of my parents' house. The walls were lined with family photos, almost all of them featuring Mark front and center. His football trophies, his prom pictures, his college graduation, his milestones framed like sacred relics. My own milestones? A few photos tucked at the edges, barely noticeable. A wedding picture from a marriage that had failed. A family photo where I stood half-shadowed beside my parents while Mark beamed in the middle. Even here, on the walls of the house I grew up in, I was invisible. I pushed open the door to the guest bathroom and shut it quietly behind me. The mirror above the sink reflected a pale, trembling woman with red-rimmed eyes. I gripped the sink tightly, trying to steady my breathing. The laughter from the dining room carried faintly through the walls. It grew louder, bolder, as though my absence had lifted a weight from them. They were free now, free from my presence, free from the awkwardness of including me. I sank onto the edge of the bathtub, pressing my palms into my knees. Tears spilled down my cheeks despite my efforts to hold them back. All the years I had swallowed my pain, convinced myself it didn't matter, convinced myself that being at the table was enough. Suddenly they all crashed down on me at once. I remembered birthdays where Mark's gifts were expensive and extravagant, while mine were practical and thoughtless. I remembered school report cards where my straight A's were met with a distracted, "good job," while Mark's soccer goals earned celebrations and cake. I remembered the countless family dinners where he dominated the conversation, and my words were drowned out or dismissed. It wasn't just tonight. It had never been just tonight. I had spent my whole life trying to earn a place at that table. And my brother had summed it all up in one cruel sentence: "Nobody wants you at this table." The worst part wasn't just hearing it. It was realizing he was right, not in truth but in how my family felt. I wiped my face with trembling hands. My chest felt heavy, like someone had placed a stone inside it. For a moment, I thought about walking out of the house, completely grabbing Ethan, leaving without a word, never looking back. But then I thought of my son, sitting there alone at that table. He was already carrying the weight of what had happened. If I walked out, I'd only burden him more. He didn't deserve to be the one humiliated too. So I stayed in that bathroom, listening to their laughter, until my tears dried and my breathing steadied. I forced myself to stand, to look in the mirror again. My face was blotchy, my eyes swollen, but there was something different in my reflection. Something colder. I had been hurt before. Never so openly, so deliberately, in front of everyone. When I finally walked back toward the dining room, the sound of forks scraping plates and glasses, clinking together, met me. They barely looked up when I re-entered, except for Ethan. His eyes met mine, wide and worried. I gave him the faintest smile, trying to reassure him. Mark chuckled mid-story, barely glancing at me before returning to his audience. The humiliation flared again, but this time it didn't sink me, it hardened me. I sat down quietly, kept my eyes on my plate, and let the noise wash over me. I didn't try to join the conversation again. I didn't force myself to laugh or pretend. I stayed silent. But inside, something had shifted. Something had cracked open, releasing years of pain and planting something new in its place. Not forgiveness. Not understanding. Resolve. What they didn't realize was that their cruelty had lit a fire inside me. Pain turned into clarity, and clarity into resolve. When the dinner finally ended, I gathered Ethan's things quietly. My parents kissed us goodnight in that distant, obligatory way, as though nothing unusual had happened. Mark didn't even acknowledge me. He was too busy basking in the glow of his own jokes, laughing with his wine glass in hand. Ethan and I walked out into the cold night air. Snowflakes drifted lazily around us, the crunch of our boots the only sound in the silence between us. He didn't speak, and neither did I. But when his small hand slipped into mine, I felt the weight of his unspoken words pressing against my heart. At home, I tucked him into bed. He hesitated before pulling the blanket up to his chin. "Mom," he whispered. "Why does Uncle Mark hate you?" The question pierced me deeper than Mark's words had. My throat tightened, and I sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his hair. "Sweetheart," I said softly. "Sometimes people say cruel things because they don't know how to be kind. It doesn't mean what they said is true." "But it felt true," he said, eyes glistening. Nobody said anything. They all just sat there. I swallowed hard, fighting back tears. I know, and that was wrong. But remember this, you and I. We're a family. We love each other. And that's what matters most. He nodded slowly, then whispered, I love you, Mom. I love you too, Ethan. Always. When he finally drifted off to sleep, I sat in the quiet darkness of his room, my heart aching. I wanted to cry again, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, a strange stillness settled over me, like the moment before a storm. I went into the living room, sat down with a notebook, and began to write. At first, it was just scribbles, the words Mark had said, the looks on my parents' faces, the silence of everyone else. But the more I wrote, the more memories spilled out. Birthdays where Mark blew out his candles while everyone clapped, and mine passed with little more than a cake on the counter. Graduations where I stood proud, only to hear my parents whisper about how Mark's achievements were more impressive. Family gatherings where my contributions were forgotten, overshadowed by his every word. I realized then that what happened at Christmas wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was the culmination of years of being overlooked, dismissed, and diminished. And I had allowed it to continue by staying silent. By smiling through the pain. By telling myself that being included at all was enough. But that night, sitting alone with my notebook, I knew something had to change. Mark had humiliated me in front of everyone, but the worst betrayal wasn't his words, it was the silence of the people who claimed to love me. My parents, my relatives. They had sat there, letting me be cut down, and not one of them had stood for me. The weight of that truth pressed heavy, but it also lit something inside me. I couldn't change them, but I could change me. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, whispering to myself, no more. No more waiting for their approval. No more begging for scraps of affection, no more swallowing my pride to make others comfortable. If they couldn't see my worth, I would make them. And if they never did, then I would learn to live without their validation. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. As I sat there, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. The kind of resolve that comes not from anger, but from finally seeing the truth clearly. They had laughed at me for years, made me small, and expected me to keep showing up. But this time, they had gone too far. This time, I wasn't going to let them laugh at me and get away with it. I began preparing not just for the next Christmas, but for my rebirth. After that night, something in me shifted. I had always been the quiet one, the one who endured, the one who smiled through the pain. But the cruelty of that Christmas, the words, the silence, the humiliation burned too deeply to ignore. It was no longer about fitting in, it was about reclaiming myself. The next morning, I sat with my coffee and opened my notebook again. The scribbled words from the night before stared back at me. Nobody wants you at this table. Underneath, I had written, no more. Those two words became my mantra. I started small. I updated my resume and began applying for better positions at work. For too long, I had accepted being underpaid and overworked, just grateful to have a job. But I realized I deserved more. Within weeks, I secured an interview for a role that came with more pay and recognition. For the first time, I walked into that office not apologizing for who I was, but proudly presenting myself. And I got the job. That promotion became the first brick in rebuilding my confidence. With the higher income, I began saving aggressively. I opened a new account in my name only, one that no family member could ever touch or guilt me out of. Each deposit felt like a declaration. I was building a future for myself and for Ethan, without depending on anyone. But it wasn't just money. I started investing in myself in other ways too. I signed up for a night class in graphic design. Something I'd always loved but never pursued because life got in the way. Sitting in that classroom, surrounded by people chasing their passions, it reminded me that it wasn't too late. I wasn't too old. I also started saying no to the endless favors my parents asked of me while never thanking me. No to Mark's manipulative calls when he wanted help but offered none in return. No to sacrificing my weekends to accommodate people who couldn't bother to respect me. Each no was terrifying at first, but each one made me stronger. Ethan noticed the changes too. "You're smiling more, Mom," he said one evening as we worked on a puzzle together. I laughed softly. "I guess I am." And I was. Because for once, my life was about more than survival. It was about growth. Months passed, and the distance between me and my family grew. They noticed, of course. My mother called once, her tone clipped. "We don't see you around much anymore." I answered simply, "I've been busy." She didn't push. She never asked what I was busy with. In their eyes, I had always been background noise compared to Mark's booming spotlight. But that was fine with me. I was no longer living for their approval. Instead, I poured my time into Ethan. We built new traditions together: movie nights with hot cocoa, weekend hikes, afternoons painting side by side. Our little family of two felt stronger, warmer, and more loving than the big table we had left behind. Still, part of me couldn't stop thinking about next Christmas. The memory haunted me, but it also motivated me. Because I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't walk into that house the same woman. I wasn't sure yet what I would do or say. But I knew this much: I wouldn't be silent. I wouldn't let their cruelty pass without consequence again. So I kept building, saving, growing, learning, becoming, and, with every step forward, I felt the distance from that broken woman in the bathroom mirror grow wider. The next time I sat at that table, I would not be the one humiliated. The more I grew, the more they shrank in comparison. By spring, I was no longer the woman who had slunk away from the Christmas table in silence. My shoulders stood straighter, my smile came easier, and my steps carried a confidence I hadn't felt in years. At work, people noticed. My boss congratulated me on my fresh ideas. Colleagues invited me out to lunches and sought my input on projects. I was no longer just filling a seat, I was thriving. Meanwhile, whispers about Mark began to surface. It started innocently enough. A colleague of mine mentioned she'd heard his business was facing financial challenges. I tucked the comment away but didn't dwell on it. Then, a neighbor of my parents confided that Mark's wife had been seen leaving the house late at night, her face pale with tears. And then another friend of a friend mentioned that one of Mark's clients had filed a complaint about shady practices in his firm. Piece by piece, the golden facade began to crack. I didn't gloat, not out loud. But privately, I couldn't help but notice the irony. For years, he had sat on his pedestal, looking down on me as the struggling sister, the divorced mother, the one who never quite measured up. And now, while I was climbing, he was falling. But the most striking difference wasn't in our circumstances, it was in our character. When I had struggled, I had kept working, kept trying, kept sacrificing for Ethan. When Mark struggled, he complained. He blamed others. He leaned harder on my parents, expecting them to rescue him, even as he still mocked me. One afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was hushed, as though she didn't want anyone to hear. "Clara," she said, "your brother is going through a rough patch. You should call him, be supportive." I held the phone tightly, biting back a bitter laugh. "Supportive?" I asked. "The same way he was supportive when he told me nobody wanted me at your table?" She sighed. "He didn't mean it. You know how Mark is, he speaks without thinking." "No, Mom," I said firmly. "He meant it. And you let him." There was silence on the line. Then she muttered, "You've always been so sensitive," before quickly changing the subject. That conversation replayed in my mind for days. It struck me how quick my parents were to excuse Mark, to shield him from accountability. They had been doing it his whole life. And their indulgence had created a man who believed he could do no wrong even when his whole life was unraveling. But I didn't need their validation anymore. I had built my own foundation. Ethan thrived too. He brought home report cards filled with A's, and when he won second place in a science fair, I cheered so loudly the entire gymnasium turned to look at me. His smile made every hardship I had endured worth it. Together, we created a life full of small joys. Movie nights, homemade pizza Fridays, weekend adventures. Our family might have been just the two of us, but it was real, solid, loving, and yet, in the back of my mind, I knew another Christmas was coming. I didn't dread it the way I had before. Instead, I anticipated it with a strange kind of calm. I wasn't walking into their house the same woman anymore. I wasn't hungry for their acceptance. I wasn't afraid of their silence. Because I had something more powerful than their approval: self-respect. And I knew, deep down, that when the time came, the cracks in Mark's life would be too wide to hide. Because this time, the humiliation would not be mine, it would be his. Christmas came again, but I wasn't the same Clara anymore. A year can change everything. 12 months earlier, I had sat at that table, shrinking into myself while my brother told me I wasn't wanted. I had walked away in silence, humiliated and broken. But this time this Christmas, I wasn't the same woman. I had rebuilt myself piece by piece. My career was thriving, my finances stable, my confidence steady. I had learned to say no, to demand respect, to live without chasing the scraps of love my family had always withheld. So when the invitation came, my mother's usual call, casual and dismissive as if nothing had happened, I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said simply. "We'll be there." Ethan looked at me when I hung up the phone. "Are you sure, Mom?" he asked. His eyes carried the memory of last year's cruelty. "I'm sure," I said with a smile. "This year will be different." On Christmas Day, I dressed carefully. Not to impress them, but to honor myself. I wore a sleek dark green dress that fit me perfectly, a soft scarf around my shoulders, and a touch of makeup that highlighted the strength in my eyes. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the broken woman from last year. I saw someone whole. Ethan, now a little taller and surer of himself, grinned when he saw me. "You look amazing." "So do you," I said, straightening his tie. "Let's show them who we are." When we arrived at my parents' house, the familiar warmth of the fireplace greeted us again, but this time, I walked in with my head high. Mark was already there, glass of wine in hand, telling one of his stories. His laugh was louder than ever, but his eyes had a shadow I hadn't seen before. "Clara," my mother said, her voice a touch too sweet, as though trying to gloss over last year. She kissed my cheek quickly, her gaze flicking over my outfit with surprise. My father nodded stiffly from the armchair. Mark smirked when he saw me. "Well, look who decided to show up." His words didn't sting this time. I smiled calmly and replied, "Of course. It wouldn't be Christmas without family." For a flicker of a second, his smirk faltered. At the table, the same spread of turkey, casseroles, and pies. But I wasn't the same Clara. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I didn't force myself into their conversations. I sat straight, listened, and spoke only when I chose to. Ethan sat proudly beside me, watching with quiet admiration. At first, the dinner flowed as it always did, Mark talking, my parents praising him, everyone else nodding along. But I noticed the cracks. His stories were exaggerated, his tone defensive. He bragged about his business, about his new car, about the deals he was supposedly closing. And for the first time, I wasn't intimidated. I knew things. I had heard whispers, and I was ready. I let him talk, sipping my wine, letting his voice fill the room. My silence unnerved him. He kept glancing at me, as though waiting for me to challenge him or shrink back. But I did neither. Because I knew my moment would come. When the conversation turned to success stories, my mother beamed at Mark. "We're just so proud of everything you've accomplished, dear." Mark leaned back in his chair, smug. "Well, not everyone can keep up. Some of us are just meant to lead, you know?" He glanced at me deliberately, daring me to flinch. But I didn't. I simply smiled, my eyes steady. And when my moment came, I would not hold back. Mark never knew how fragile his throne really was. For most of dinner, I stayed quiet, letting Mark perform. He always needed an audience, and tonight was no different. He gestured with his wine glass as he bragged about his expanding business empire, his exclusive clients, and his unmatched success. My parents ate it up, nodding with shining eyes. "We're so proud of you, Mark," my father said, beaming like his son had just cured cancer. But I noticed the details. The way Mark's voice faltered when he talked about his finances. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The way he avoided specifics, sticking to vague claims. I decided it was time. So, Mark, I said lightly, setting down my fork. How's that lawsuit going? The one your client filed a few months ago? The room froze. My mother's fork clinked against her plate. My father cleared his throat. Mark's face drained of color. What lawsuit? My mother asked quickly, turning to him. Mark forced a laugh, waving his hand. Oh, Clara must be mistaken. You know how she exaggerates things. I tilted my head, calm. Funny, because I heard it was about mismanaged funds. Something about promising returns you couldn't deliver? His jaw clenched. You don't know what you're talking about. I smiled. Maybe not. But I do know the court records are public. Whispers rippled around the table. My cousins glanced at each other uneasily. My father shifted in his seat, suddenly looking less proud. Mark tried to recover. Every successful businessman faces setbacks. It's nothing serious. Of course, I said smoothly. And I suppose the debt collectors calling the house are just part of the plan too? Gasps broke out this time. My mother's face turned pale. My father's knife scraped against his plate. His appetite gone. Mark's voice rose. Desperate now. That's none of your business. I leaned back, my expression serene. Neither was Christmas last year, Mark. But you made it your business to humiliate me in front of everyone. Funny how the truth feels different when it's pointed at you. The silence was heavy. For the first time, Mark wasn't the one commanding the room. He was cornered. Exposed. Vulnerable. He stammered, searching for words, but nothing came. His smug confidence had evaporated, leaving only panic. My parents looked at me, then at him, their faces filled with something I had never seen before, doubt. And I knew, in that moment, his pedestal was crumbling. And with every word, I watched the golden boy turn to dust. The silence around the table was louder than any insult I had ever endured. Mark's face burned red, his hand tightening around his wineglass. He looked like a cornered animal, wild and desperate, his confidence slipping through his fingers. This is ridiculous, he snapped, pointing across the table at me. She's just jealous. That's all this is. Clara's always been bitter because she couldn't keep up with me. She failed at marriage, she failed at her career, and now she's trying to drag me down with her. His words cut, but not the way they used to. Because this time, I wasn't the Clara who shrank under his voice. I wasn't the sister who silently absorbed his cruelty. I smiled. Calm. Unshaken. Is that the best you've got, Mark? More insults? Because last year, you seemed to think you had all the words in the world. He froze, his eyes narrowing. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady, deliberate. Do you remember what you said to me at this very table? You looked me in the eye and said, "Nobody wants you at this table." The room went still. My mother's eyes widened, my father's jaw tightened, and my cousins shifted uncomfortably. The memory hung in the air, undeniable, undeniable. I let the silence stretch, then continued. Well, Mark, look around. Who's laughing with you now? Who's proud of you now? You wanted me gone from this table, but it looks like you're the one nobody wants here. Gasps broke out softly around the table. My mother covered her mouth, my father looked down at his plate, and my cousins stared at Mark with open discomfort. For once, his charm wasn't saving him. His jokes weren't working. His voice wasn't dominating. He slammed his glass down, the sound sharp. You think you're so clever, Clara. But you'll always be second best. Always. I didn't flinch. Second best to what? Lies? Debt? Failure wrapped in arrogance? His face twisted in rage. He pushed his chair back abruptly, screeching against the floor. I don't need to sit here and listen to this. And just like that, he stormed away from the table, his footsteps pounding down the hallway. A door slammed somewhere in the house. The silence he left behind was thick, suffocating. Everyone's eyes turned to me, waiting to see if I would crumble, if I would backtrack, if I would apologize for speaking the truth. But I didn't. I picked up my fork calmly, took a bite of the casserole, and said, "This is delicious." A ripple of uneasy laughter broke the tension. The power had shifted, and everyone knew it. For the first time, I wasn't the one humiliated. But I wasn't finished teaching them all what respect really meant. The truth had shattered Mark, but it was only the beginning for me. The echoes of Mark's slammed door still lingered when I set my fork back down. The table was frozen, everyone looking at me as though waiting for the next explosion. For years, I had been the one they dismissed, the one they silenced, the one who swallowed her pain. But tonight, that version of me was gone. I took a slow sip of water, then set my glass down carefully. My voice was calm when I spoke, but every word carried the weight of decades. "You all let him do it." The room went dead quiet. My mother's hands fidgeted in her lap. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My cousins looked anywhere but at me. I continued. "Last year, when he told me I wasn't wanted here, do you know what hurt the most? Not his words. Yours. Or rather, your silence. Not one of you said a thing. Not one of you stood up for me. You all sat there and let me walk away in humiliation." My mother's lips parted as if to protest, but I held up my hand. "No, don't tell me I'm too sensitive. Don't tell me he didn't mean it. He meant it, and so did you, because when you said nothing, you agreed with him." My father cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "It wasn't our place to interfere." "Wasn't your place?" I cut in sharply. "I'm your daughter. Your family. If it wasn't your place to protect me, then whose was it?" He looked down, shame flickering across his face. I softened my tone slightly, but my resolve didn't waver. "Do you know what Ethan asked me that night?" He asked why his uncle hated me. Imagine that. A 12-year-old child had to witness his mother being treated like garbage at her own family's table. Do you know how hard I had to work to convince him that I was worth loving after that? My mother's eyes brimmed with tears. "Clara, we didn't realize. That's the problem," I said quietly. "You never realized. Or maybe you never cared to. Because as long as Mark was shining, nobody noticed how much I was dimmed." The silence was unbearable. For once, nobody rushed to defend Mark. Nobody laughed to lighten the mood. Nobody dismissed my pain. They couldn't, not anymore. Ethan looked at me then, his small hand resting gently on mine under the table. His eyes shone with pride, and that gave me the strength to keep going. "I'm not saying this because I want your pity," I said firmly. "I don't need pity. What I need is respect. And if you can't give me that, then I will stop coming here. I will stop forcing myself into a family that pretends I don't belong." My words landed like thunder. My cousins shifted in their seats, murmurs rippling. My father rubbed his temples. My mother whispered my name. But there was no denial in her voice, this time only regret. I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady. For the first time in years, I felt taller than all of them. Because I wasn't the one who needed them anymore. They were the ones who needed me. And healing, I realized, was now in my hands. Power isn't loud, it's steady. In the months after that Christmas, something remarkable happened. My life flourished. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, but it was steady, consistent, and real. Every day that I chose myself, every boundary I enforced, every no I refused to feel guilty about it, all built into something solid. At work, my efforts paid off. I earned another promotion, this time to a leadership position. Colleagues who once overlooked me now sought my guidance. I wasn't the invisible one anymore. I was respected. Ethan thrived too. His grades stayed high, and he began to blossom socially, making friends who appreciated his kindness. At one school event, his teacher pulled me aside and said, "He's one of the most thoughtful boys I've ever taught. You must be proud." And I was. Proud of him. Proud of myself. proud of the little world we had built together. Meanwhile, whispers about Mark grew louder. His business was faltering badly. The lawsuit I had mentioned at Christmas wasn't the only one. Debts piled up, and word spread quickly. The charm he had always relied on wasn't enough anymore. Clients wanted results, not excuses. Investors pulled out. At home, his marriage crumbled. His wife left him, taking the children with her. I heard through the grapevine that she had grown tired of his arrogance, his lies, his refusal to change. The man who had once mocked me for being divorced now faced the same fate, only his was splashed across the community in gossip and pity. For years, my parents had defended him, excused him, elevated him above me. But even they couldn't deny what was happening now. My mother called me one evening, her voice weary. "Your brother, he's struggling, Clara. He's not the man he used to be." I answered simply, "He's exactly the man he's always been. You're just finally seeing it." There was silence on the line. She didn't argue. She couldn't. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. His downfall wasn't my victory. My victory was quieter, deeper. It was knowing that I had built something lasting while he had built his life on sand. My parents began leaning on me more. Small things at first, asking for advice with bills, help around the house. I helped, but with boundaries. No more sacrificing myself completely, no more accepting their neglect. If they wanted my presence, it had to come with respect. For the first time, they gave it. That was the quiet revenge I had craved all along. Not watching my brother fall, but watching myself rise. Christmas was approaching again, and with it, the inevitable question, would I return? The answer, in my heart, was already yes. Not because I needed them, but because I wanted them to see. To see me not as the invisible daughter, not as the one they could mock or dismiss, but as the woman I had become. And this time, I wouldn't just sit at their table. Because this time, I was the one at the head of the table. Respect became my quiet revenge. By the time the next Christmas rolled around, everything felt different. Not because the decorations had changed, not because the food was any different, but because I had changed. I walked into my parents' house with Ethan by my side, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was stepping into enemy territory. I didn't shrink. I didn't brace myself for humiliation. I knew who I was now, and nothing they did could take that from me. Mark wasn't there. His absence was the unspoken headline of the evening. My mother fussed over the turkey, my father poured drinks, my cousins chatted nervously but no one mentioned him. It was as though he had become a ghost in his own family. When I asked where he was, my mother hesitated before saying quietly, "He didn't feel up to coming." I nodded, saying nothing more. I didn't need to. Everyone at that table knew the truth. The golden boy's crown had slipped, and he couldn't face it. Dinner began, and for once, the conversation wasn't all about Mark. People asked me about my job, Ethan's school, about the community projects I had been involved in. I answered calmly, not bragging, but not hiding either. And they listened. Really listened. It struck me then that this was what I had always wanted, not applause, not pity, just respect. After dinner, my mother pulled me aside into the kitchen. Her hands twisted nervously in her apron. "Clara," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. For last year. For many years." Her words caught me off guard. My mother had never admitted fault before. Not once. She looked down at the floor. "We let Mark say things he never should have. We should have defended you. We didn't. And I'm sorry." I stood there, stunned. Part of me had longed to hear those words for decades. Another part of me had stopped needing them months ago. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. "But I'm not the same woman I was. I don't need your approval anymore. I just need respect. For me, and for Ethan." She nodded, tears in her eyes. Later that evening, my father approached me too. His voice was gruff, uncomfortable. "You've done well for yourself. I didn't give you enough credit. I see that now." It wasn't a grand apology, but coming from him, it was monumental. That night, driving home with Ethan, I realized something. Revenge hadn't come from tearing my brother down. It had come from lifting myself up so high that they could no longer ignore me. Mark had isolated himself in shame. My parents had shifted their focus to me. The cousins who once laughed at his jokes now sought my advice. The entire dynamic had changed, and I hadn't had to scream, beg, or break myself to make it happen. All I had done was demand respect, and in the end, that was more powerful than anything else. But even then, a part of me knew my story wasn't finished, because while my parents' words brought closure, and while my brother's downfall gave me space, there was still more I wanted. Not revenge, something greater. And I had survived what was meant to break me. For the first time in decades, I felt like the author of my own story. The holidays looked different after that. Not because I stopped showing up at my parents' house, though I went less often, but because I stopped depending on those gatherings to define my worth. Instead, Ethan and I started creating traditions of our own. On Christmas Eve, we baked cookies together, laughing as flour dusted the counters and the dog stole a piece of dough. On Christmas morning, we opened gifts in our pajamas, sipping hot cocoa and playing board games until noon. In the evenings, we watched old movies curled under blankets, our little living room glowing with twinkling lights. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't the grand holiday spread my parents prided themselves on. But it was ours. And it was filled with love. I realized then that family isn't defined by who shares your blood, it's defined by who shares your respect. Over time, my circle expanded. Friends I'd made through my classes and community projects became part of our celebrations. One year, I hosted a dinner at my house for people who, like me, had felt overlooked or unwanted by their families. We filled the table with laughter, stories, and warmth. And when I looked around that night, I realized something. I no longer needed a seat at the table where I'd been told I didn't belong. I had built my own. Meanwhile, my brother continued his downward spiral. His name came up less and less at family gatherings, spoken only in hushed tones. He avoided me entirely, unable to face the truth I had forced him to confront. But I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't even think of him with bitterness. I simply thought of him as someone who had chosen a path I no longer had to walk beside. Ethan thrived through it all. By his teenage years, he was confident, kind, and ambitious. One evening, as we decorated the tree together, he said, quietly, "You know, Mom, you're my hero." The words hit me harder than anything my family had ever said. Tears pricked my eyes as I hugged him tight. Because that was the only approval I had ever truly needed. Looking back, I saw how far I had come. From the woman who once cried in a bathroom because she was told she wasn't wanted, to a woman who stood tall, respected, and loved in the life she had built for herself. The memory of that Christmas still lingered, but it no longer hurt. It had become a turning point, a reminder of the night I chose myself for the first time. And in choosing myself, I had chosen freedom. And the woman I became was worth every battle. What began with humiliation ended with empowerment. I'll never forget that night at the Christmas table, when my brother looked me in the eyes and said, "Nobody wants you at this table." At the time, it felt like my whole world collapsed. My family sat in silence, confirming the very thing I had feared my entire life, that I didn't belong. But here's the truth I've learned since then. Sometimes the moment that breaks you is the very moment that frees you. If Mark had never humiliated me, maybe I would have kept shrinking myself forever. Maybe I would have kept begging for scraps of attention, mistaking them for love. Maybe I would have continued living in the shadows of other people's approval. But that night forced me to see the truth. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their table. What I needed was respect. And the only way to earn respect was to demand it, not with shouting, not with anger, but with steady, undeniable strength. Over time, I realized something else too. My brother's cruelty said more about him than it ever said about me. His arrogance, his downfall, his inability to take responsibility, all of it was a reflection of his own weakness. And my parents' silence? That was their failure, not mine. I had carried their choices like a burden for years, believing their treatment of me defined my worth, but it never did, because my worth was never up for debate. Now, when I look at my life, I don't see the woman who walked away from that table in shame. I see a woman who built her own table, filled with laughter, love, and respect. I see a son who knows his mother is strong, who knows what self-respect looks like, who knows he is loved unconditionally. And that's the legacy I'm proud to leave behind. Not a legacy of bitterness, but of strength. Not of revenge, but of dignity. So if you've ever been told you're unwanted, if you've ever been silenced, if you've ever been pushed aside by the very people who should have lifted you up, hear me when I say this. Their words don't define you. Their silence doesn't define you. You define you. Sometimes being told you don't belong at their table is the greatest gift you'll ever receive because it pushes you to build one of your own. And when you finally sit at that table, surrounded by love and respect, you'll realize what I did. Because in the end, walking away quietly was the loudest thing I ever did.